In 2004, Akashic Books, a small independent publishing house based in Brooklyn, New York, published the first volume of what it hoped would become a series. Entitled Brooklyn Noir, the volume contained original short mystery and suspense stories that all shared a Brooklyn setting. Since the publication of that inaugural volume, Akashic's City Noir series has gone on to achieve huge success. It now numbers dozens of titles, and forthcoming entries in the series include volumes set in Rio, Prague, Addis Ababa, Lagos, and Marrakesh. The success of the series confirms the continued primacy of the city as the default setting for mystery and suspense fiction. But for my purposes in this lecture, I want to emphasize the global scope of the series. One of the most exciting and energizing developments in the field of mystery and suspense fiction over the past 20 years has been the genre's continued spread over the entire globe. And the success of Akashic Books is just one example of that spread. Driven in part by the success of Nordic noir, particularly Stieg Larsson's Millennium series featuring Lisbeth Salander, publishers are now more willing than ever before to either translate or commission crime fiction from countries that previously would have been considered a bad investment. Consequently, we're in the middle of a boom in international crime fiction, with classic texts coming back into print in new translations, and new writers being published for the first time, some writing in their native languages, and some in English. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to the work of mystery and suspense fiction writers from outside Anglo-America, Europe, and Scandinavia. By looking more closely at work that might not be known to even avid fans of the genre, we'll see not only that the genre once again demonstrates its ability to be endlessly recombined and reinvented to address a dizzying range of issues, but also that it's flourishing as never before. The first stop on our world tour is Japan, where mystery and suspense fiction has been popular since at least the 1920s. The key figure in the genre's early history and subsequent mainstreaming in Japan is Taro Hirai, who wrote under the pseudonym Edogawa Rampo. His fondness for the work of Edgar Allan Poe can be seen by the fact that if you pronounce his pen name quickly, it is meant to sound like a Japanese version of Poe's full name. Rampo began his writing career in 1923, when he published a mystery story entitled The 2-sen Copper Coin, in a magazine that had previously published the work of Poe, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and G.K. Chesterton. However, this was the first time the magazine had published a piece of mystery fiction by a Japanese writer, making it a landmark in the context of the Japanese version of the genre. As you might expect from a writer so heavily influenced by Poe and Doyle, Rampo's first story is a puzzle mystery, but adapted to a Japanese context. Taking a tale of logical ratiocination that seems to come straight from Poe, but using a Japanese example to demonstrate the method of analysis associated with Auguste Dupin. In this case, a code based on a Buddhist incantation, as well as Japanese language Braille. This indicates Rampo's inventiveness and his ability to change the inherited tradition of mystery and suspense fiction to suit his own purposes. Over the course of a long and productive career, Rampo would prove his ingenuity and creativity again and again in a large number of stories and novels that ran the gamut from puzzle mysteries to locked room mysteries, such as 1925's The Murder on D Hill. He even wrote a series of mysteries for younger readers, featuring a group of young detectives that Rampo called the Boy Detectives Club, that's still read by many young people in Japan today. They might be considered the Japanese equivalent of the Hardy Boy or Nancy Drew mysteries. Rampo and his work are also important for a couple of other reasons. Being a fan and a student of the genre as a whole, Rampo took care to establish institutions in Japan that would encourage and support this type of work. In 1946, he helped support the founding of a new journal named Jewels that would feature mystery fiction. And in 1947, he founded the Detective Authors Club, which in 1963 was renamed the Mystery Writers of Japan. Apart from his interest in homosexuality, another feature of Rampo's work may come as a surprise if you think of Japan as being a rather straight-laced and repressed culture. Even though Rampo had a fondness for traditional, formal elements of the genre, such as the puzzle and locked room mysteries, from the beginning of his career, he combined this traditionalism with unusual, even surreal elements. For example, Rampo also wrote stories that included sadomasochism, the case of the murder on D Hill, and even a story about a man who hides inside a chair to feel the bodies sitting on top of him, the human chair. You could even argue that this combination of traditional formal devices and surreal or unusual content is one of the hallmarks of Japanese mystery and suspense fiction. After World War II, there was something of a reaction against the use of fantastical elements in Japanese mystery and suspense fiction. Perhaps influenced by a post-war sense of despair and pessimism, the genre moved away from a dependence on traditional, formal, and puzzle elements, and instead embraced a kind of social realism, resulting in stories and novels in which Japanese society as a whole, rather than an individual criminal, was under investigation. The work of Seicho Matsumoto is a good example of this turn toward the real in Japanese crime fiction. In novels such as Points and Lines, Inspector Imanishi Investigates, and Pro Bono, Matsumoto focuses on the ordinary lives of Japanese people and on human psychology. In addition, his interest in corruption, both among the police and among criminals, tends to make his work even darker and very different from the whimsical surrealism of much of Rampo's work. Although Japanese mystery fiction today is so varied that it's very difficult to generalize about, it's important to note a couple of other developments before moving on. In the 1980s, a kind of reaction to the social realist school of mystery writing emerged in the work of writers like Soji Shimada. Known variously as New Traditionalist or New Orthodox crime writers, authors like Shimada argued for the restoration of the rules that governed the production of classical detective fiction, and they aimed to produce a kind of mystery writing that was self-consciously artificial and self-reflective. In his 1981 debut novel, The Tokyo Zodiac Murders, Soji Shimada begins with a foreword that challenges readers to solve for themselves the mysteries that he's about to describe. Shimada also claims that every reader will have access to all the clues they need to solve the mystery, and that none of the characters will have an unfair advantage over the reader. Clearly, we're back on traditional ground, in that the novel is set up as an elaborate game or challenge that is played between the reader and the writer. This is very different from the world weariness of the social realist school of Japanese mystery writing as personified by Matsumoto. But as I said, it's very difficult to generalize about a genre as diverse as Japanese mystery fiction. If some writers were persuaded by Shimada's call for a return to tradition, others definitely were not. Some of the most exciting work being written in the genre today features very dark and extremely violent plots, along with philosophical elements that frequently cause this work to inhabit that blurred line between popular and literary fiction. Both Natsuo Kirino and Fuminori Nakamura, for example, are writing work that is very challenging. In novels such as Real World and Out, Kirino pulls no punches as she plumbs the depths of the Japanese underworld and explores how the lives of ordinary people can quickly spin out of control. Meanwhile, in novels like Evil and the Mask and The Gun, Nakamura is writing philosophically complex meditations about human evil that apparently owe as much to French existentialism and the work of Friedrich Nietzsche as they do to mystery and suspense conventions. And thanks to the booming market in international crime fiction, the good news is that all of this challenging material is available in translation. The next stop on our tour is Africa. Until recently, Africa wasn't much of a destination for people interested in the genre. It wasn't that there was no work being produced there, but publishers were unwilling to take a chance on publishing African mystery and suspense fiction until someone could show them that there was a market for it. The writer who almost single-handedly changed this situation was the Scottish author Alexander McCall Smith. In 1998, he published the #1 Ladies Detective Agency. All the novels in what would become an incredibly popular series are set in the town of Gaborone, Botswana, and feature Precious Ramotswe as the protagonist. At the start of this first novel in the series, Precious's father has died and has left her all his cattle. Going against expectations and tradition, Precious sells the cattle and uses the proceeds to open a detective agency despite having no experience and despite widespread local skepticism about whether a woman can even be a detective. Over the course of the novel, Precious gradually proves her detractors wrong. And by novel's end, although the future of her business is anything but secure, Precious thinks of herself as a detective without apology. What is the secret of this novel's success? And how did this success persuade publishers of mystery and suspense fiction that Africa was now fertile territory for the genre? The short answer to this question is that with the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, McCall Smith succeeded in creating something that many people would have thought of as a contradiction in terms: the African cozy mystery. So what exactly is an African cozy mystery? I would argue that Precious Ramotswe's closest analog in mystery and suspense fiction is Agatha Christie's Miss Jane Marple. Like Marple, Precious has no formal training as a detective. Like Marple, Precious is often underestimated by people, especially the men around her. Like Marple, Precious knows everything and everybody in her community and uses that knowledge to her advantage. And like Marple, Precious doesn't need specialized training in order to do her work. All she needs is empathy, patience, common sense, and determination, and she has all those qualities in abundance. Apart from the similarities between Precious and a typical cozy detective, #1 Ladies Detective Agency is also cozy in terms of its setting. Gaborone is McCall Smith's version of Christie's St. Mary Mead, It's a small community with very specific local traditions and customs, and Precious is very much at the center of this community. Even though Botswana borders South Africa, and McCall Smith often refers to Botswana's neighbor, I think it is crucial that he did not choose South Africa as the primary setting of these books. Why? Because building a cozy mystery series would be much more challenging in the context of the reality and then the legacy of apartheid. This is not to say that South Africa is an inhospitable environment for mystery and suspense fiction. Indeed, quite the contrary. But only a variation on the hard-boiled would do. To put it another way, rural Botswana is at least potentially cozy in a way that South Africa very definitely is not. It's important to mention that in many respects, crime is not even the primary element in the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series. Yes, Precious is a detective, and yes, she does investigate and solve mysteries, but most of the cases she takes involve relatively minor crimes and often concern issues such as domestic violence and marital infidelity that a large number of McCall Smith's readers have likely experienced themselves, which is another reason why the series is so popular. If crime is only one of the issues that McCall Smith explores in this series, then what are the others? Precious's own life and the life of her friends, family, and the community around her form the bulk of what gets discussed in any given novel in the series. And as Precious tends to travel quite widely around her community, this gives McCall Smith the perfect opportunity to introduce local color elements into his novels that non-African readers are highly likely to find both interesting and educational. In fact, the differences between the rural, traditional, and indigenous ways of life on the one hand, and the urban, modern, and foreign ways of life on the other often provide the main point of conflict in the series. In the first novel, for example, the main crime under investigation is what looks to be a muti killing, which is when a young person is murdered so that certain parts of their body can be used for witchcraft. The presence of such a crime gives McCall Smith an opportunity to have Precious consider the tensions between the old ways and realities of living at the turn of the 21st century. It eventually turns out that the boy thought to have been murdered is in fact alive and well, and Precious returns him to his family. In this manner, McCall Smith reaffirms his commitment to producing a cozy mystery in an African setting and thus cements his success. The beneficiaries of McCall Smith's success include African mystery and suspense fiction writers of every kind, and not just those who aspire to write African cozies. Kwei Quartey, for example, is the author of a series of police procedurals set in Ghana. These feature protagonist Inspector Darko Dawson, a homicide detective in Accra, Ghana's capital. Beginning with the publication of Wife of the Gods in 2009, the Darko Dawson series is much closer to being hard-boiled than McCall Smith's series. Some of its grittiness comes from Quartey's use of the urban setting of Accra, whereas McCall Smith capitalizes on the rather old-fashioned assumption that Africa is synonymous with the rural rather than the urban. Quartey makes full use of the chaotic urban texture of the Ghanaian capital city. In his debut novel, Wife of the Gods, the source of conflict is between scientific, that is Western, medical knowledge on the one hand, and traditional medicinal practices on the other. In Children of the Street, the second novel in the series, Quartet explores the plight of the street children of Accra, who are being killed off at an alarming rate in what is either a form of traditional ritual killing or a modern case of serial murder. These plots indicate that, like McCall Smith, Quartet often uses what he perceives as tension between traditional and modern aspects of Africa to energize his plots. In Murder at Cape 3 Points, which is set on Ghana's coast, Quartet examines the conflicts that arise when land that has been occupied by a traditional fishing community for hundreds of years is targeted by rapacious real estate and oil companies. Again, the detective occupies that contentious middle ground where the traditional and the modern collide, sometimes with explosively violent results. In Wife of the Gods, while investigating the murder of a medical student who was disseminating information about AIDS prevention in rural Ghana, Darko Dawson finds himself fighting with the local witch doctor about his trichosi. These are young women betrothed to this traditional healer, both as a form of tribute and in order to protect the women's families from harm. Although Quartet technically presents both sides of the trichosi issue, it's clear from Dawson's antipathy toward the traditional healer where his sympathies really lie. Like McCall Smith, writers like Quartet walk a fine line between including enough familiar elements from mainstream Western mystery and suspense fiction to make their work appealing to non-African readers, while also including details that are specific to the African context that those very same readers will find appealing due to their unfamiliarity. Judging from Quartet's success, he's managed to strike that balance. But it's interesting to note that some African critics and reviewers have not been so impressed. Noting that Quartet has spent much of his life in the US after being born in Ghana, his mother is African-American, one African reviewer said of Quartet that he doesn't really know much about rural life in Ghana, and that he shows a peculiar interest, almost an obsession, in the Ghana that appeals to the foreign tourist. Clearly, writing mystery and suspense fiction in Africa leaves one open to accusations that one is inauthentic, perhaps because one is seen as importing a foreign genre into an inappropriate context. Before moving on to our last stop, I want to mention briefly a final example of African crime fiction that makes a virtue out of the potential for inauthenticity. And that's Nairobi Heat, a novel by Mukoma Ngugi, the son of internationally renowned African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Born in the US, raised in Kenya, and now living in the US, Mukoma draws on his ambiguity about his own identity in his novel. His protagonist, Ishmael, is an African-American homicide detective from Madison, Wisconsin, who travels to Nairobi in his attempt to solve the murder of a famous African peace activist. Once in Kenya, Ishmael has to confront the complicated history of the relationship between Africans and African Americans, while also working under the shadow of the Rwandan genocide as he searches for the truth about a single murder. Nairobi Heat is an impressive novel that works on a number of different levels simultaneously. But the one I'd like to emphasize is what Mukoma implies by bringing together the Rwandan genocide and a homicide investigation into a single murder. What is the meaning or the importance Mukoma encourages us to ask of an individual death in the context of the death of hundreds of thousands of people? Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question. But I give Mukoma credit for asking it because it requires us to think about the purpose of mystery and suspense fiction as a whole. If it dignifies a single death by investigating it and then finding and punishing the perpetrator, does the genre also risk overlooking death when it happens en masse rather than on the individual level? This is a good question to keep in mind as we move on to the final stop in our tour, Latin America. Due to the political history of this part of the world, mystery and suspense fiction writers from this region often have reason to consider the relation between the violence of the individual and state violence. With this point in mind, I'd like to recommend a wonderful book by critic Persephone Braham entitled Crimes Against the State, Crimes Against Persons, which is a comparative study of mystery and suspense fiction in Cuba and Mexico. According to Braham, examples of the genre in both countries are deeply engaged with considering the relationship between crime and the state. But what exactly counts as both crime and the state in these two countries is complicated. In closing this lecture, therefore, and with appropriate acknowledgement of the influence of Braham's work on my own reading, I'd like to look more closely at the work of two authors she draws on in her case studies, Leonardo Padura Fuentes and Paco Ignacio Taibo II. Padura was born in Havana, Cuba in 1955, where he still lives. He began his career as an investigative journalist, and some of that same muckraking impulse survives in his crime fiction. Although his first novel is a love story, he's best known to English-speaking readers for his quartet of crime novels published between 1991 and 1998 and translated under the following titles: Havana Blue, Havana Gold, Havana Red, and Havana Black. Padura's collective name for the quartet is the Four Seasons, because the books are set respectively in the winter, spring, summer, and autumn of 1989. The year is important because 1989 marked the beginning of what became known as the special period in Cuba that was triggered by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the same year. The economic impact of this dissolution on Cuba was severe and lasted for most of the 1990s. During this period, Cubans had to come to terms with the consequences of living in the post-Soviet era. And that is why Padura's quartet of novels is often described as morality tales for the post-Soviet era. The series' protagonist is the world-weary police lieutenant Mario Conde. The crimes he investigates allow Padura to show Havana and Cuba as a whole in a state of decay. The streets are dangerous and shabby, violence and corruption are always lurking just beneath the surface, and the only dependable people in Conde's life are his immediate family and those he has known since his childhood. Collectively, the Havana Quartet contains many criticisms of Cuba and the Castro regime, but the criticisms are all implied and could only have been made during the special period, when the state of decay could be blamed on the withdrawal of Soviet support. By contrast, there's nothing implicit about the social criticism contained in Mexican writer Paco Ignacio Taibo II's work. Ever since the late 1960s, when he was a leading figure in student protests against state violence and corruption, Taibo has been a thorn in the side of successive Mexican political administrations, not least because his books are tremendously popular. Although he has written a number of non-fiction works, including a huge biography of Che Guevara, Taibo is best known for his series of idiosyncratic private eye novels featuring Hector Beliscaran Shane. In these novels, Taibo works tirelessly to expose political and economic corruption at the highest levels of Mexican society. but he does so in a manner that combines humor, absurdity, despair, anger, cynicism, and political analysis all at the same time. Though they offer no concrete or practical solutions to the problems that he identifies, it is impossible to come away from a Tabo book without feeling energized and hopeful. A closer examination of one of his books will give you a better idea of why this is so. In 2004, Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation contacted Tabo and asked him if he would like to collaborate on a novel. The result was an extraordinary piece of work called The Uncomfortable Dead, with alternate chapters written by Marcos and Tabo. In the novel, Beliscaran Shane teams up with Elias Contreras, an investigator from the Zapatistas, to try and solve the crimes committed by a mysterious individual named Morales. As the investigation proceeds, the detectives realize that the corruption and crimes they're fighting are so widespread and so systemic, they include globalization, privatization, and even capitalism itself, that they are looking for multiple Moraleses. Once they reach this point of the investigation, Beliscaran Shane and Contreras decide to each choose their own Morales and punish him appropriately. The Zapatista investigator takes his Morales back to Chiapas in southern Mexico, the home of the Zapatistas. After a trial, Morales is sentenced to 10 years community service. This might seem like an absurdly inappropriate sentence, and in a sense, it is. But the fact that Morales absolutely loathes the idea of doing anything to help the Zapatistas actually makes this sentence the perfect example of poetic justice. Beliscaran Shane, meanwhile, finds his Morales, but realizing the futility of turning him over to a judicial system that is just as corrupt as Morales, Beliscaran Shane takes matters into his own hands and kills Morales by throwing him down a stairwell. Absurd, violent, angry, and despairing in equal measure, the solutions that Tabo explores succeed in capturing the reality of a country as violent and seemingly lawless as contemporary Mexico. In The Uncomfortable Dead, Tabo not only makes a valuable contribution to analyses of the current situation, but also demonstrates the flexibility and power of mystery and suspense fiction to address the world around it. By both engaging with the details of their specific cultures and then connecting these details to issues of interest to people around the world, mystery and suspense fiction from Japan, Africa, and Latin America makes a valuable contribution to the genre.